In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to fix a miscrossed cable without ripping back or laddering down using duplicate stitch. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. If I have live stitches on the needle and I discover I have miscrossed a cable just a few rows later, I can use a technique called laddering down, where I can just let those stitches off the needle and undo the rows until I get to the row that was miscrossed, recapture those stitches on the needle, and then knit my way back, crossing the cable correctly using the strands of yarn here. I have a video on that technique, which I'll link to up in the upper right hand corner, but also down in the video description. This swatch is simulating a project that has been completed, and then the discovery is made that there was a miscrossed cable. Now, in this kind of situation, you could actually still have live stitches on the needle and just you don't discover the miscrossed cable until you're way beyond it. The options for fixing a mistake like this, if you still have stitches on the needle, would be to ladder down just this span of stitches down to where the miscrossed cable was and then re-knit them all the way up. But that means you have to re-knit all of these cables that were perfectly crossed. So I tend to reserve a laddering down when I have discovered the miscrossed cable soon after making the mistake. The further along you get, the more of a hassle it is to have to ladder down that many stitches. But you could also not discover the error until the project was complete. So what I'm going to show you today is how you can fix this error, or hide it anyway, using a technique called duplicate stitch. So duplicate stitch is a technique that's sometimes called Swiss darning, and it's often used as an embroidery technique, or could be used as a reinforcement technique if you have some stitches that are getting worn and you want to reinforce them. The idea is that you're tracing existing stitches with a new piece of yarn. So I have a little sample swatch here, and this is, if you don't understand duplicate stitch or you've never done it before, this is a really good exercise to do. I have some worsted weight yarn that normally would be knit on US 7 or 8 needles, which is 4 to 4.5 millimeter needle. But instead, I used a much larger needle to make the stitches looser so that they're easy to spread apart and to see what's going on with the contrast yarn. And I just knit one row of contrast yarn in here. So the idea with duplicate stitch is that you are tracing the path of existing stitches. So I have some light green yarn on a needle here. So I'd come up through the base of a stitch where you see one of those contrast green colors. And I'd bring my yarn up, and then I'd look to see where is the dark green yarn going. It's coming up here, and then it's coming behind the two legs of the stitch above it. I can pull the yarn through. You can see now that I'm covering up that leg of the stitch. And then where is the yarn going now? Well, it's going back into that stitch where I originally came from. And then it is connecting to its neighboring stitch behind and coming up through the center like this. So you're coming under the leg of one stitch and a leg of the stitch next to it. And you pull the yarn through, and you have covered up that stitch. So you can keep following the path of this row of stitches, and you can understand how a strand of yarn travels along a row of stitches. So this is a technique that can be used for reinforcing a thin spot. It can be used to add color, a small motif, in a place where you've knit everything in a solid color. It can be a way to correct color work where you've put the wrong color in the wrong place and you can cover it up with the right color. But you can also use it to correct a miscrossed cable. So this is the miscrossed cable here. We have 4 stitches, and instead of the 2 stitch columns on the left crossing over the top of the other 2 stitches, we ended up having them cross underneath. And so we end up with a left crossing cable instead of a right crossing cable. The stitches are all in the correct positions, they're just not layered correctly. And so what we want to do is trace the stitches from the base stitch before the crossing and attach it to the stitch in the row above the crossed row. So we want to identify what all the rows are that we're talking about. When we looked at our swatch here with these dark green stitches, we could see that they came out of a stitch below and then they surrounded a stitch above them. So we want to figure out where the row of stitches is that the crossing row is coming out of, and then what is the row of stitches that they're surrounding that are above the crossing row. We can see that these 2 stitches are the ones that are crossing on top. That means these stitches are the row below. So we know we've got these 2 stitches, and then we've got their neighbors, which are kind of hidden underneath. So it's those 4 stitches there are the base stitches, and we can tell we've got the 4 stitches correct because we can look at the row below as a reference for that. So we know that we have 4 stitches in a row. And then we look at the stitches that are above those that are crossing over, and we can see it's these 2 stitches, and then we can find the ones that are coming out from below. So these are the row above. So we need to create our duplicate stitch by coming up out of those stitches and around the top of those stitches there. We want to bring our needle up through stitch number 3. And we want it to come around this stitch up here. I'm going to pull these needles out right now. We want it to come out around that one. And then again, it has to go back into where it came out of before. We want to come up through its neighbor. And then we need to bring this around the stitch it's connected to up here. And then once again, we want to go back down through the center of the stitch where we came out. So at this point, we've created these 2 stitches. They may not look quite right, but we have the ability to correct the tension. We've got these yarn tails, and we can correct the tension in order to make them look as close as they should to the other stitches. If you look closely, you may think, oh, well, these look a little bit flatter, but we can also pinch these a little bit to get them to comply and look more like an actual cable. And then when we back up, we see that really nobody would be able to tell that that was originally a miscrossed cable. Duplicate stitch is a great way to correct mistakes in stockinette-based fabric, but it has other uses too. This video over here demonstrates how I use reverse duplicate stitch on the wrong side of stockinette to weave in yarn tails. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox.